You might think you understand how American farms work, but the reality operating behind our food system would surprise most people. Research reveals that undocumented workers don't just supplement agricultural labor, they dominate it, making up 50 to 70% of the entire workforce. That's not a small dependency. That's structural reliance on 1.2 to 1.7 million people working without legal status. The implications ripple through everything from food prices to national security. Agricultural employment has already dropped 6.5% as this workforce faces increasing pressure, offering us a glimpse of what happens when the invisible becomes visible. The question becomes urgent. What happens to the food on your table when the people who harvest it can no longer hide in the shadows? California's Central Valley stretches toward the horizon, with endless rows of crops that create an agricultural empire worth billions. These fertile fields produce the fruits and vegetables that stock every American supermarket shelf, from strawberries and lettuce to grapes and citrus fruits that travel across the continent to reach dinner tables. Walk closer to these fields during harvest season, and you'll notice something most consumers never see. The workers moving through the rows speak primarily Spanish, many avoiding eye contact with strangers who approach the field edges. Their movements are practiced and efficient, hands selecting ripe fruit with precision that comes from years of experience. The reality becomes clear when you examine the numbers from agricultural research. Unauthorized workers account for approximately 42% of crop farm workers nationwide, creating a substantial workforce that operates largely outside official employment systems. This represents a parallel economy that most Americans never encounter. Research shows that labor-intensive crops like strawberries, lettuce, and citrus fruits depend heavily on this workforce. These aren't seasonal fluctuations or temporary arrangements during peak harvest times. This represents the permanent architecture of American agriculture, a structural foundation that has evolved over decades. The geographic concentration extends beyond California's borders. Florida's citrus groves and vegetable fields demonstrate similar patterns, where undocumented workers form a significant portion of operations that supply oranges and tomatoes to national markets. The Midwest vegetable farms follow comparable models, creating a network that spans multiple agricultural regions. These workers possess specialized knowledge passed down through generations. They understand exactly when fruit reaches perfect ripeness, how to harvest delicate produce without damage, and which plants show early signs of disease. Their expertise extends beyond simple manual labor to encompass quality control standards that determine whether crops meet commercial requirements. The labor-intensive nature of harvesting makes this knowledge invaluable. Citrus fruits require careful handling to avoid bruising that would render them unsuitable for retail sale. Strawberries must be picked at precise moments to ensure optimal flavor and shelf life. Lettuce harvesting demands understanding of proper cutting techniques that preserve freshness during transportation. But this expertise operates within a system of legal vulnerability. The same workers who possess irreplaceable agricultural knowledge work without basic employment protections or legal recourse when problems arise. Their unofficial status creates a workforce that is simultaneously essential and precarious. The dependency runs deeper than most people realize, extending into regions throughout rural America. Small farms across the country rely on similar labor arrangements, creating a national network of food production that operates parallel to official employment systems. This agricultural empire generates billions in economic value while operating on a foundation that exists outside legal frameworks. The contrast between the scale of production and the unofficial status of the workforce creates inherent instability within America's food system. When you examine the full scope of this dependency, the numbers reveal a startling truth. We're not talking about supplemental labor or seasonal help. The research indicates that undocumented workers make up between 50 and 70% of the national agricultural workforce, translating to approximately 1.2 to 1.7 million people out of a total farm worker population of 2.4 million. The answer reveals the first crack in America's food security. Our most essential crops depend on workers who could disappear overnight through policy changes or enforcement actions. This creates a vulnerability that extends from individual farms to the entire national food supply chain, affecting everything from grocery store prices to restaurant menus across the country. But these raw numbers only tell part of the story. The true scale of this workforce becomes clear when you understand exactly who these people are and how deeply embedded they've become in America's rural communities. The mathematics behind these communities reveal a workforce larger than the entire population of Philadelphia or Phoenix, embedded throughout rural America. You might assume that 1.2 to 1.7 million undocumented workers represents a small fraction of farm labor, but approximately 20 to 25% of all undocumented adults in America identify agriculture as their primary occupation, creating a concentration more than 10 times higher than native-born citizens working in farming. These numbers translate to a workforce that forms the backbone of agricultural regions you encounter throughout the country. From California's Central Valley to Florida's citrus groves, from the Midwest's vegetable farms to Texas cotton fields, undocumented workers represent the majority of hands actually touching the crops that reach your dinner table. Yet these workers remain invisible to most Americans, living in rural areas where few outsiders venture and media attention rarely focuses. They occupy housing complexes tucked away from main roads, shop at small markets that cater to Spanish-speaking customers, and send their children to rural schools where English learners often outnumber native speakers. The scale becomes staggering when you realize this workforce handles the most labor-intensive aspects of farming. These are the delicate hand-harvesting operations that machines cannot replicate. Chinas, the careful selection of ripe fruit that requires human judgment, and the precise handling that prevents damage during picking and packing. Network hiring systems connect experienced agricultural workers to farms nationwide, creating established pipelines that many operations depend on entirely to maintain their workforce from season to season. This recruitment method has become so embedded in agricultural operations that it represents the standard approach across multiple regions. From planting seedlings to sorting produce, these workers possess skills that took years to develop and cannot be easily replaced. Many have worked the same farms for decades, becoming irreplaceable assets to operations that depend on their expertise. Their knowledge extends beyond simple manual labor to understanding plant diseases, optimal harvest timing, and quality control standards that determine whether crops meet commercial requirements. Workers can assess fruit ripeness by touch, identify pest problems before they spread, and maintain productivity levels that keep farms profitable. This accumulated expertise represents generations of hands-on agricultural knowledge developed through direct experience with American crop production. But the contradiction emerges as you examine their legal status. America's most essential workers exist in legal limbo, unable to claim basic protections or rights that other employees take for granted. The fear of deportation prevents them from reporting unsafe working conditions, wage theft, or other forms of exploitation. This precarious situation creates vulnerability that affects not just individual workers but entire agricultural operations. Farms that depend on experienced crews face constant uncertainty about workforce stability, while workers who have invested years in developing specialized skills have no guarantee they can continue using that expertise. The irony becomes clear when you consider the mathematics of agricultural expertise. The people who possess the deepest understanding of American crop production, who know the specific requirements of different plants, and the precise timing needed for optimal harvests, operate without the legal security that would allow them to fully contribute their knowledge to the system. This reveals the second structural flaw in our agricultural system. The people who know our food system best have the least security within it, creating instability that affects everything from individual farm operations to national food security planning. The legal vulnerability that makes these workers valuable to employers also creates conditions where exploitation becomes inevitable. When your workforce cannot seek legal protection, the boundaries of acceptable treatment begin to disappear entirely. The morning alarm sounds at 4 a.m. in farm worker housing across America, but many workers never know if they'll receive their promised wages. These essential workers face a daily reality of wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and zero legal recourse, all while producing the food that feeds the nation. Their vulnerability stems from a system that depends on their labor while denying them basic workplace protections. The very legal status that makes them valuable to employers also makes them vulnerable to exploitation that would be unthinkable in other industries. Employers understand that undocumented workers cannot report violations without risking deportation, creating conditions where abuse flourishes unchecked. This dynamic transforms agricultural workplaces into environments where standard labor laws become meaningless. Workers handle dangerous pesticides without proper protection, exposing themselves to chemicals that cause immediate skin irritation and long-term health problems. The protective equipment that should be standard remains absent from many operations, leaving workers to choose between their health and their livelihood. Extreme heat conditions compound these dangers, with workers laboring through temperatures that would trigger mandatory breaks in other industries. When complaints arise, workers face immediate retaliation. Supervisors know that firing an undocumented worker carries no consequences, since the worker has no legal avenue to challenge wrongful termination. This power imbalance creates workplaces where safety violations and abuse continue without interruption. Wage theft occurs at alarming rates across agricultural operations. Workers find themselves victims of employers who manipulate pay scales, withhold overtime compensation, or simply refuse payment for completed work. Some workers lose hundreds of dollars weekly to these schemes, as research shows employers are aware that their victims are unlikely to report such offenses due to fear of deportation or retaliation. These financial losses extend beyond individual paychecks to affect entire families. Workers who planned on sending remittances home find themselves unable to support relatives in their countries of origin. The unpredictability of payment makes budgeting impossible, forcing families into cycles of debt and financial instability. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these workers were deemed essential, yet received inconsistent health protections compared to other essential workers. Many lacked access to personal protective equipment, COVID-19 testing, and vaccination opportunities that were readily available to other essential worker categories. The designation as essential workers brought no corresponding improvement in working conditions or legal protections. The isolation of rural work sites compounds these problems, creating environments where abuse can flourish without oversight. Agricultural operations often occur miles from populated areas, making it impossible for workers to seek immediate help during emergencies. This geographic isolation prevents outside observation of working conditions and eliminates the social pressure that might otherwise discourage employer misconduct. Language barriers and social marginalization amplify every risk, from workplace injuries to emergency situations. Workers who suffer injuries often lack the English skills needed to navigate healthcare systems or report workplace accidents. Cultural isolation prevents them from understanding their rights or accessing support services that might exist for documented workers. Medical emergencies become life-threatening when workers cannot communicate their needs effectively. The combination of geographic and linguistic isolation creates conditions where treatable injuries become permanent disabilities and minor health problems escalate into serious conditions. This exploitation creates the third crack in our food system. The constant fear of deportation and lack of legal protections results in workforce instability and high turnover rates that disrupt farm operations and lead to significant crop waste. The constant flux of workers prevents farms from developing the stable, experienced crews needed for optimal productivity. The economic consequences of this broken system extend far beyond individual farms. When the workforce that harvests America's food operates under these conditions of systematic vulnerability, the entire supply chain becomes unstable. The question becomes whether consumers understand how this hidden crisis affects what appears on their grocery store shelves. Walk into any American supermarket and you'll see perfectly stocked produce sections that suggest a stable, reliable food system. Those gleaming apples, fresh lettuce, and ripe strawberries create an illusion of abundance that masks the fragile foundation supporting it all. The displays of perfect fruit and vegetables suggest an agricultural system running with clockwork precision, where supply meets demand without interruption. But this stability is an elaborate performance. dependent on a workforce that could be disrupted by a single policy change or enforcement action. Every piece of produce represents multiple stages of handling by workers, whose legal status makes the entire system vulnerable to sudden disruption. The supply chains that deliver fresh produce to your local store operate on razor-thin margins and precise timing that undocumented workers make possible. Agricultural employment experienced a 6.5% drop from March to July, contrasting sharply with the small increases seen in previous years. This decline signals the early stages of workforce instability that could cascade through the entire food system. Fresh produce requires harvesting at exact moments to maintain quality during transportation and shelf life. Strawberries picked too early lack sweetness, while those harvested too late spoil before reaching consumers. This precision timing depends on experienced workers who understand the subtle signs of ripeness that machines cannot detect. When this workforce becomes unavailable, the entire supply chain breaks down. When labor shortages occur, entire crops can rot in fields, while grocery prices spike and availability plummets. Research shows that at least 1.2 million foreign-born individuals left the U.S. labor force between January and July, creating immediate impacts on agricultural production. The mathematics reveal the scope of this dependency. Unauthorized workers comprise at least 25% of the total agricultural workforce, and about 42% of crop farm workers. The economic modeling shows that mass deportations could trigger food price increases that would impact every American household budget. From April to July, the cost of fresh vegetables increased by 2%, while meat prices rose 1.9%. These early indicators suggest that workforce disruptions already contribute to rising food costs. As Vanessa Cardenas of America's Voice states, the mass deportation agenda is not just bad immigration policy, it's economic sabotage that hurts all working families. Certain crops like berries, leafy greens, and tree fruits would become luxury items if their current labor model collapsed. These crops require intensive hand labor that cannot be mechanized without significant quality losses. The delicate nature of harvesting raspberries, the precise cutting required for lettuce, and the careful handling needed for tree fruits all depend on human expertise developed over years of experience. The transformation from staple foods to luxury items would reshape American eating patterns. Families who rely on affordable, fresh produce for nutrition would face difficult choices between healthy eating and budget constraints. The ripple effects would extend beyond individual households to impact public health, childhood nutrition programs, and food assistance initiatives. Distribution centers that coordinate produce shipments across regions require consistent volumes to operate efficiently. Restaurants that feature fresh ingredients in their menus face unpredictable costs and availability. The interconnected nature of modern food systems means that disruptions at the farm level create cascading effects throughout the economy. This reveals the final structural truth about America's food system. The affordable abundance that Americans take for granted is built on a foundation that could crumble without warning. The gleaming produce sections that suggest stability actually represent a system operating at the edge of sustainability, dependent on workers whose legal vulnerability makes them essential yet expendable. The crisis demands solutions, but the answers being proposed from Silicon Valley boardrooms may not match the reality unfolding in America's fields. Silicon Valley investors are pouring billions into agricultural technology, promising robots and AI will solve the farm labor crisis. These innovations offer hope for reducing dependency on vulnerable workers while maintaining food production, but the reality proves more complex than the marketing promises suggest. Current technology can handle some aspects of farming, but the delicate work of harvesting ripe fruit and tending growing plants still requires human judgment and dexterity. Autonomous tractors excel at plowing fields and applying fertilizers across vast acreages, performing repetitive tasks that don't require nuanced decision-making. But when it comes to determining whether a strawberry has reached perfect ripeness or identifying which tomatoes are ready for harvest, machines fall fall short of human capabilities. Robotic harvesting systems can pick apples from trees using mechanical arms and computer vision, yet they struggle with the subtle variations in fruit placement and ripeness that experienced workers navigate effortlessly. The technology works best in controlled environments with standardized crops, failing when confronted with the natural irregularities of agricultural production. The gap between digital analysis and physical reality becomes apparent when examining the limitations of current automation. Satellites can detect general crop health and growth patterns, but they cannot assess the texture of individual fruits or identify the subtle color changes that indicate optimal harvest timing. This granular assessment requires the tactile knowledge that human workers develop through years of hands-on experience. The most promising technologies work alongside human labor, rather than replacing it entirely, creating hybrid systems that enhance productivity. GPS-guided tractors reduce the physical demands of field work, while allowing workers to focus on tasks requiring human judgment. Automated irrigation systems free up labor for harvesting and plant care, multiplying the effectiveness of available workers. These tools also offer potential solutions for improving working conditions through better monitoring and accountability. Digital time tracking systems can prevent wage theft by creating transparent records of hours worked. Temperature monitoring devices can trigger mandatory breaks during dangerous heat conditions, protecting worker health through automated safety protocols. However, the timeline for meaningful technological replacement extends decades into the future, not years. The complexity of replicating human dexterity and decision-making in agricultural settings exceeds current technological capabilities. While incremental improvements continue, breakthrough technologies that could fundamentally reshape farm labor remain in experimental stages. The economics of agricultural automation also present challenges, as the high costs of advanced robotics make them impractical for many farming operations. Small and medium-sized farms that produce significant portions of America's fresh produce cannot afford the capital investments required for comprehensive automation. Technology reveals both the path forward and the immediate reality. We need solutions that protect and legitimize the current workforce while building toward a more sustainable future. The choice facing America is whether to address this reality proactively or wait for crisis to force change, understanding that technological solutions alone cannot solve the complex human dimensions of agricultural labor. The automation revolution remains years away, but the agricultural system operating today generates billions in value while existing largely outside legal frameworks. This contradiction between economic scale and legal invisibility defines the true scope of America's agricultural challenge. America's agricultural system generates billions in economic value while depending on workers who exist outside legal frameworks. This hidden network spans from California's Central Valley to Florida's citrus groves, employing 1.2 to 1.7 million undocumented workers who harvest the fresh produce that stocks every American supermarket. The nation faces a fundamental choice between two paths: continue operating a food system built on legal vulnerability and exploitation, or create comprehensive reforms that provide pathways to legal status while establishing genuine workplace protections. The current system benefits from cheap labor while avoiding responsibility for the human costs, creating unsustainable conditions that threaten both workers and food security. The next time you walk through a grocery store, remember that every piece of fresh produce represents human stories of resilience and vulnerability, people whose expertise feeds America, while their contributions remain invisible and unprotected.